In the normal way of things, we'd be talking to our next guest in the Islington in the normal word in your ear live format. But of course, more important issues have made that impossible. But I'm delighted to say we're joined on the line to a special word in your attic by Paul Gorman. Paul, good morning.
Good morning.
Surely.
Good to see you.
Applause.
Yeah, lovely to see you.
Thank you very much.
Now, Paul would have been coming along to talk about his excellent new biography of Malcolm McLaren, The Life and Times of Malcolm McLaren. But anyway, you've sorted out, I think, 10 objects that can guide us through the story of Malcolm McLaren. So why don't we hand over to you and you can do that.
He operated in many spheres, and so if you pick an object, usually it's got relevance somewhere else. Right, and the first one I've picked, which I haven't got arranged behind me in this rather jumble sale-like arrangement, is this, which is the original script for the movie Who Killed Bambi?
Really?
Which was the first version of what became The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, which McLaren worked on with the king of the Z movies, Russ Meyer. When McLaren was negotiating the Pistols Warner Brothers contract in America, he took the opportunity, because he was moving very fast at this point. They'd already been fired by two labels, I think. This is early summer 1977. The group's only been in existence for 18 months, and already he wants to make a biopic, kind of setting the myth into legend, or whatever phrase you want to use. And so he took the opportunity when he was in LA to hook up with Russ Meyer, and together with his mate Rory Johnson and another person, they spent a weekend in the Chateau Marmont knocking out this, which is...
Can you imagine that?
Yeah, exactly. Well, apparently Meyer and McLaren couldn't be in the same room from very early on. They absolutely well, I think McLaren loved the idea of Meyer. Meyer just hated McLaren altogether. He just knew that he had access to money to get a film made, because he'd been through a pretty patchy career since one of his films, but in the early 70s. So they put this together, and it's quite funny. It's got elements that survived into The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, but McLaren himself is heavily satirised as P.T. Boggs, this Cockney charmer, kind of wide boy manager. So already he's beginning to take the mickey out of himself, but also place himself centrally in the story. Quite musical. And it would have made a good Meyer B movie, actually. But they pulled the plug. Fox, who were going to fund the film, found out about it, and the idea of the Sex Pistols, Russ Meyer together, freaked out Grace Kelly, Princess Grace of Monaco, who was on the board of Fox.
Oh, so everybody's in this story.
This is brilliant.
There you go. So she went, hold on, that's it. So Marianne Faithfull was going to play Sid Vicious's mother.
Oh, of course.
PJ Proby was going to play the rock star who was killed by one of the Sex Pistols, maybe even Johnny Rotten. It had an all-star cast.
It had hit written all over it, didn't it?
It's a great PJ, yeah.
Yeah. So what's next?
What's next? Behind me is this T-shirt. It's not an original, but it was designed by Malcolm McLaren, along with four others, to celebrate the greats of rock and roll. Well, four of the greats of rock and roll, and Screaming Lord Sutch, who all played at the London Rock and Roll Festival in August 1972.
This is when,
and that was Chuck Berry and Little Richard and
Berry Lee, Bo Diddley.
That's right, Bo Diddley, Bill Haley, everybody apart from Elvis, really, wasn't it? It was a significant event.
Yeah, and it was the first live music event at Wembley.
It was.
Yeah.
Run by the Folks Brothers, who'd organised the Isle of Wight festivals. And there is a film of it online. McLaren's in it because he set up this stall for his Teddy Boy Emporium, Let It Rock, and he designed these T-shirts to go with it. This is the one featuring Chuck, of course. And what he did was, as a typical ex-art student, he'd been at various art colleges for 8 years and had studied and was, had graphic skills and had painted. And so he used, like all great art students, found material. So this comes from a Spanish lobby card for the Spanish version of the film Rock, 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 1956 film produced by Alan Freed, I think, or presented by him. And so it's got that kind of flavour of where he was going to head with the artworks that he created with Vivienne Westwood and Jamie Reid for the Sex Pistols.
Right. Because the impression I got from the book is what you're trying to do is stress the fact that the Sex Pistols, which is the thing he's kind of best known for, was only one part of a really long career of doing all kinds of things.
All kinds of nutty things as well. I mean, the Sex Pistols themselves were an experiment. You know, you'll know that he wanted them to rival the Bay City Rollers, who were the big deal at the time. Yeah. I mean, he had a very peculiar worldview, didn't he? And so he'd look at something and go, "Oh, okay, well, this will look great." But whereas in fact, it sometimes looked very strange.
Yeah. So much of it was about chucking a rock in the pond, wasn't it? About the Situationists and joining the King Mob gang, and they smashed windows to be kind of anti-capitalist, and they burned the American flag outside the embassy.
Yeah, when he was arrested, that's the first time he makes the news. Yeah, and the Times in 1966, Malcolm Edwards, sculptor of Hendon.
That's right.
Which always makes me feel good because I'm from Hendon, and so it's the only bit of infamy.
So if you go into his kind of press clippings, they go way back, don't they? They don't start with the Sex Pistols in any way. I think you've got a copy of The Enemy. Is that the next thing?
Exactly. This is from April 1974, and it's really the first time he appears in the music press in this great article by Nick Kent called The Politics of Flash, which looked at those people who made the clothes for the rock stars of the period. And it's typical Nick Logan. If you think about what Nick did with the face as well, he looked at the culture around music, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
And of course, as an ex-mod, you know, he's very, very interested in visual style. And so this is the piece.
Oh, right, okay.
And there's McLaren.
Oh, so he gets his picture in there.
He gets his picture in there, looking fabulous.
That's his picture. Oh, yes.
God. If I think about that,
Smith.
I probably read that issue. It's amazing.
Well, you know, I did because I had nothing else in my life as a 14-year-old, really, in Hendon.
So what's next?
It's this book, The Servant, which is a very slim book, unlike mine.
Oh, right.
Came out in 1948 by Robin Maugham, Somerset Maugham's nephew, I think. Yes. And the dramatist Harold Pinter wrote the screenplay for Joseph Losey's incredibly great and creepy film. I think it's been on the BBC recently, hasn't it?
I think it was on the BBC recently, yeah.
And so McLaren knew Pinter of old because Pinter's mother knew McLaren's grandmother. She brought him up.
He was so connected. His mum, didn't his mum go out with the tycoon who owned Selfridges or something? Exactly. He was so connected, wasn't he?
She was his mistress.
That's right.
And also Sir Isaac Wolfson, who was this amazingly rich and powerful retail magnate, had Universal stores in the 40s and 50s. She was also his mistress. But so because his mother was flighty, because his father had disappeared when he was 2 years old, he was brought up by this very domineering grandmother who kind of inculcated him in all of this dysfunction, in a way. Told him that to be bad is good because to be good is simply boring.
To be good is boring, that's right.
And so his grandmother...
And had that thing about boys will be boys, whenever he did anything wrong. And she had no kind of regard for any kind of morals or principles.
She was totally amoral. And I think, you know, because he came from this very troubled background where he was at once rejected by his parents, but yet indulged, you know, I think that really messes with your head.
Was it her that makes the point that he thought that he never really understood people and they thought that people would abandon him and disappoint him? And he was constantly looking for a gang, wasn't he?
Yeah, it's his partner in his last years, effectively his widow, young Kim, but she makes that point about that relationship. And so you see a lot of his work is incredibly collaborative. You know, he works with Jamie Reid, he works with Vivienne Westwood, he worked with Nick Egan, the art director. But so... one thing that tickled me is that Pinter appeared yet again in the story in the late 90s when, you'll know, the record companies were kind of beginning that great trawl through the archives, box sets and all that stuff. They got him on board to advise about coming up with musicals post Mamma Mia based on catalogue. and he came up with the idea of a musical based on The Servant. Which, if you've ever seen it, you'll know that that's going to be a pretty dark journey.
With the Kinks and the Zombies and what was it?
The Herd. Yeah. Who recorded Chalk and Cheese? Is that the Searchers? No, I can't remember. But he loved that song, and it also.
Sorry, interrupt you a second. Did you just mention The Herd?
The Herd.
Mark, have you still got it? Right.
We were talking about this the other day.
We're going to have a brief commercial break here. What were Mark and I talking about yesterday?
We were talking about great album covers. And I just dug this out of the roof. Isn't that fantastic?
That is great. That's a pair of slacks that Frampton has on there.
Yeah, this is 1967 or 68, and they're wearing sheer crimson PVC plastic jackets. I mean, it's just wonderful. Isn't that
what
a great
would have been
cover?
called kinky at the time?
Yeah, kinky.
It's a kind of a compliment.
Yeah.
Kinky.
Absolutely right.
Sorry. I just couldn't let that mention of the Herd mess without introducing that. Anyway, carry on. So his proposal was to make a kind of a movie or whatever around
a musical, which would then be made into a movie, which would then regenerate the catalogue. So it's kind of a good idea, but never going to work with the Servant. Well, maybe it could have worked. We'll never know.
Who knows? It could have done. It could have done.
Yeah.
What's next?
So this is the towering post-war study of menswear. By
you've recommended this to me before. Is that an original copy? So that's by the great Nick Cohn.
Yeah, exactly. One of the great writers, right? One of the great studiers of music and beyond. And so this came out in 1971. There's pictures of some teddy boys there. This Vince Mann shot was very influential.
Yeah.
And McLaren used this as kind of the spark to open his store, Let It Rock, in the King's Road, because this looked at the power of clothing and the way in which it could suggest rebellion and anti-authoritarianism. And so then it wasn't the only thing, but it was important to him. And him and Helen Minenberg, who was his friend from Goldsmiths, they were art students at the time, they loved it. And when Let It Rock went through another iteration as Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die, which was dedicated to the bikers and rockers and ton-up boys of the early 60s, the kind of people who appeared in The Leather Boy, the great movie with the great Dudley Sutton, sadly passed now. That's covered in this book. And McLaren got his tailor to make zoot suits and the American look. That's covered in this book as well. So it's a very important text for him.
Right. What's next? What else have we got?
Dances of the World's Peoples is really... Folkways was a great label, wasn't it? It's got really great production values. That's kind of marbled, almost leather, I don't know, card, heavy card, very heavy card, really great design. These were later used as figures in artworks. I mean, that's great, isn't it?
Oh, was it yellow?
1958.
Yeah.
And so McLaren came across this while he was researching porn soundtracks in the Beaubourg Library in the wake of the collapse of the Sex Pistols, when he was basically run out of town for having spent their money on his film. He was really kind of inspired by ethnic music, pre-world music, field recordings and this stuff. This was a whole series of albums Folkways made across the world. So there's Caribbean to Africa to Scottish waltzes. And this later popped up in his album Duck Rock, which was originally called Folk Dances of the World.
Which I've got there.
There you go.
Yeah. Let's both do it.
If you turn yours around,
it's like
Mark,
a TV program.
Turn yours around, Mark. Then you'll see that this runs around the cover. So I think it's got Electric Boogaloo and then runs around. So it was supposed to be all of a piece, if you see what I mean. But so this was Dances of the World's People. Folk Music of the World's Peoples was the original title, and it was a travelogue around the world, which is what Duck Rock became.
Because he keeps doing this in the book, in his life. He keeps going back to the library, doesn't he?
Yeah, he was a great student. I met Robin Scott actually at McLaren's funeral. Robin Scott of M. Remember?
Who I interviewed at the time of M.
Yes.
I went and looked him up again last night after looking at your book. I couldn't believe,
He's a good interview, right? Very smart bloke.
It's a long time ago. Yes, he was. Very smart bloke.
And so they met at Croydon College and they organised an uprising there during '68 with Jamie Reid. And he said that McLaren was always flitting between art history lectures. And he was really absorbing information. And in fact, at the launch party, which of course we didn't have, we were going to have it at the Standard Library in King's Cross. And we were going to have his library, all the books that influenced him.
Yeah.
Because it was incredibly important. Yeah. And I'll come back to the importance of libraries and books in a sec.
What's next?
He also heard in the Boborg Library, it's field recordings of the Burundi tribe in Africa. And he fancied the librarian there and asked her to put it on. And there's a track of the last Chambo Ima, which is really the Burundi beat, the recognizable beat with all the hollows and shouts and everything. She put it on at 45 rather than 33. And a light bulb went off and he forgot about chatting her up and inviting her out for a drink and realized that this could be a new rhythm for rock and roll. So
you just do it faster.
Yes, exactly.
That's a wonderful story.
Didn't somebody, was it Dave Robinson or somebody, one of those label owners used to turn up the speed a little bit on all the tracks? So
I think Dave Robinson did it for the first Damn single, didn't he? Yeah, that's right. Yeah. For the whole album, actually.
Yeah, it's pretty fast, isn't it?
Well, Nick Loaded, the producer.
Yeah, and so this was incredibly important because then he returns from Paris, hooks up with Adamant, goes to a wedding, bumps into Adamant, whose career is on the floor. They're kind of second division punk band, Adam and the Ants at that stage.
Definitely.
And he says, and asks him for advice, and he says, I'll charge you £1,000 and work for you for a month and make all these suggestions, and then you can go away and do it. And that's exactly what happens. And so, Ant, I don't call him Ant. I think
Mr. Ant.
Adamant, then, wrote Kings of the Wild Frontier and all those hits that, use the African rhythms.
Absolutely.
So McLaren, in the meantime, as you well know, stole his backing musicians.
Yes.
Them together with Annabella Lewis.
Bow wow.
Bow wow.
It's a busy life. What's next?
This is campaign material for the Malcolm McLaren mayoral campaign.
Oh, right. What year was it?
2000, that's right, yeah.
It was the first election. There's a nice promo photograph. But I like this. Anyone could be a Sex Pistol. This is 2000. And it was sponsored by Alan McGee, who went to Sony Records and said he needed £20,000 for an art project. And of course, at that point, they'd give him anything because of the
Oasis,
they'd made Oasis. And so it lasted quite well. There's some stickers there. Malcolm needs your help. There's some stickers there. But some of the slogans were, it was pre-populist. It was like, this is too important a job to give to a politician.
Right.
So it's kind of pre-Trump in a way.
Yeah.
On the manifesto, the greatest manifesto point for me was that all libraries should be licensed. So you could drink a pint of Guinness while you read Dickens.
Oh,
that could have saved libraries.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a great investment in libraries. All three of my brothers were librarians, and that could have saved libraries, couldn't it? What a great idea.
That's still not a bad idea. I can think of some libraries I could suggest that to. What's next?
So we're getting down to it now, but you'll recognise this.
Oh, right.
Well, yeah, I've just dug that out of the attic too, yeah. It's fantastic...
Were you the editor?
No, you were the editor. It was just before you left.
Actually,
I thought this was a very significant piece because it's Neil Tennant interviews him, doesn't he?
He does, yeah.
And Neil Tennant starts off by being a little bit sort of a little bit sort of skeptical about it all, because this guy says that pop music is dead, doesn't he? He kind of says nothing's happening. Yeah. People are going to movies. He says nowadays kids would rather go to a movie, Star Wars, Blade Runner, E.T. than buy a record, etc. And his whole thing is, if you reactivate the past and make new records out of old records via scratching, this new technique which we then knew nothing about, then it would invent a whole new world. And at the end, can I just mention the bit at the end, which is really, I think it's really significant. McLaren says, I think this can happen here. Suddenly discotheques, because they're making live music out of scratching old records, suddenly discotheques will be more vigorous and exciting than any concert on the stage of the Hammersmith Odeon. Live discotheques, I actually think that'll happen.
Yeah.
But it's quite significant,
it's
isn't
very
it?
prescient.
It's club, it's club culture.
Yeah.
Before club culture, I think the Face cover story, the making of club culture, was like 6 months later. So it was in the air. He's one of those people that things are happening, and sometimes maybe he did appropriate beyond his, purview. But at the same time, he is predicting quite often pop cultural movements, such as the downloading of music and streaming in the mid-90s. There's an interview with him where he talks about that, which kind of makes sense, actually. But so
well, also Bow Wow Wow, the cassette pet and all that business. I mean, it was the tape revolution. The only thing he got wrong is that nobody ever got bothered about cassettes. They were just a functional thing, you know what I mean?
Yes, exactly. And it was very difficult to package them. And of course, packaging was an enormous part of his sell.
Absolutely.
His interest.
It was an enormous part of the record business's sell. It was, they were in the packaged goods business. Yeah. So what are we looking at here? The great Billy Fury.
So when Charles M. Young, the late Charles M. Young, great writer for Rolling Stone, I think in my mind, he wrote one of the best pieces on Punk and the Pistols at the time, because Rolling Stone sent him to London. He had great access. He visited McLaren at his flat. McLaren kept him waiting for 2 hours at his flat in Clapham. He arrived, started talking, saying, "We hate you, basically. We hate your culture. You represent the past." And the phone rings, and somebody informs McLaren of Elvis Presley's death. And he says, "Pity it wasn't Mick Jagger. It's like your grandfather's died." So, and Charles M. Young is right there in, he's got access to them all. It's a really good piece, and it's online at the moment. I recommend you read it. But this is among the records that Young in those 2 hours spots in the record rack. And Billy Fury meant so much to McLaren. He really, really adored him from the age of 16. When he was 17 and at Harrow Art School, him and his mates, Fred Vermerel and Patrick Casey, used to imitate Fury's hunch, because he was quite tall, wasn't he? And he had that sort of hunch, and he had that vulnerability as well. And when McLaren came to make his final year film, was his entry for his art degree, about the story of Oxford Street. At one point, he approached Fury to narrate it. And Fury's agent said, well, he's really giving up the music business at the moment. He's more interested in wildlife. And McLaren suggested that they do the interview within the aviary at Regent's Park. If you like wildlife, he could do the narration there. Turned it down. But very sadly, in the spring of 2010, 10 years ago, McLaren had been diagnosed with cancer and in and out of various clinics and trying loads of different treatments. And the last record he listened to before he left for the clinic where he died was a Billy Fury record.
Oh, really?
And so it was, there was this kind of vulnerability to him as well. And he loved Fury because he was such a romantic figure, wasn't he, Fury? He was kind of heartbroken, but brutally handsome.
So it's a fantastic book, Paul. It's a huge, it's a huge piece of work. If anybody's looking for a lockdown read, this will last as long as the lockdown.
You'll actually want lockdown to continue, so you can finish it. It's really, really good.
So what are you working on next, Paul?
Well, it's the rewrite of I'm working on various projects, but the main one I've got to deliver this summer is the rewrite of In Their Own Right, which will be a narrative.
Which is the music press book.
That's the history of the music press, which I still think is the only history of the music press.
It probably is. And if anybody, I don't know if is it still in print? It's probably not in print at the moment.
I don't think it is, no.
But it's very much worth reading.
At the launch party, the late great Charlie Gillett, who you'll recall very well.
Yeah.
I said to him, "What do you think?" And he went, "You should have written a narrative." I wanted to hear what you thought, and I thought, "Oh Christ, he's right." And so for the last 20 years,
so that's what you're doing. Yeah.
So I'm really looking forward to getting my teeth into that. I mean, the McLaren book was quite exhausting. It took 6 years.
Well, it's a fantastic piece of work, Paul, and I'm sorry we couldn't have a normal word in your ear live event with you there, but this is the next best thing. Well, so we've got to look at your objets and to look in your lovely home, and let's finish by you holding up your finished copy of your book so people can read.
If I can, as you say,
if you can lift it, there it is, The Life and Times of Malcolm McLaren by Paul Gorman. Look at it. Never mind the quality, feel the width.
See you later, chaps.
All right.
Cheers.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.